Oxfam is calling for more income tax rates on the richest earners. This, as most countries, including South Africa, are still experiencing high levels of inequality. The call comes ahead of the G20 summit taking place this month in South Africa. Joining us is Isobel Frye, Senior Policy Advisor for G20 at Oxfam, South Africa. Isobel, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Hugo. It's great to be here.
So when we talk about taxing the super rich, and I've been reading that over the last few years, the super rich have gone incredibly wealthy. What is it that you're attempting to do, and what are the benefits? Who's likely to benefit from the super rich being taxed?
Sure. I mean, it is a trendy byline, tax the super rich, but there is a bit more behind it. I think firstly, just to say the increase in inequality is a global phenomenon. We know that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, but 83% of countries across the world suffer high income inequality. So by tackling the emergency of inequality, we need to do so at a global level. The point about the super rich is that they are very good at organizing their tax affairs to escape paying a fair share. I mean, that's really what we're saying, is that people should pay a fair share. So many of the super rich not only receive income, salaries like you and I, but they also get a lot of income from wealth, assets, so dividends from shares, etc. And very few countries have got significant wealth taxes. So in South Africa, people argue and say, but the very wealthy pay a significant amount of income tax. We do have a progressive tax rate, which means the richer you are, the more you pay. But wealth is significantly undertaxed. So what Oxfam's calling for in South Africa and across the world is for wealth to be taxed and for that to go back to the public revenue. We've seen a significant shift of wealth from the public purse to private purses, and that means that the state's ability to fund quality healthcare, education, social security is significantly affected. But there's also a huge impact on democracy, because when the wealthy form an elite, there is often an elite compact with the political elites. And so that leads to an environment where calls for greater taxation fall on deaf ears, because the compact at the top is quite a secure one.
Well, that's a conversation I'd like to have a little bit later on. But so this campaign that Oxfam is carrying out, hashtagging it, Tax the Super Rich, is it different from any campaigns we've seen previously?
It's quite a long-standing campaign. I mean, it's been around since last year, so it's not brand new, but it came out at the end of the Brazilian G20, where President Lula committed all G20 members to a greater taxation, and that was inspired by an expert report by Gabriel Zucman, who really called for the fact that wealthy people should, in total, pay at least 2% of their riches in tax. So is
2% too much? I mean, it doesn't sound like an awful lot.
It certainly doesn't. But many wealthy people pay less than that, pay less than a full percentage, because of the way they structure their affairs. So there are a number of components of the call for the taxation of the super rich. I think the first one is to call on countries to share data, because you can't tax people who make wealth in one country if they move it to another, and you have no access to that. So that's the first stage, and that's really part of a UN tax convention that is being pursued by countries such as South Africa. In addition to the need to share information, we're also looking at the reduction of illicit financial flows. So through a number of ways, companies who make money, profits in a country like South Africa, where we have a lot of multinationals who do mining, they manage to do a combination of transfer, mispricing, etc., so that the wealth is not declared here, the profits are not declared here, and the wealth is moved offshore to tax havens where companies face...
Is this legal?
It can be legal, and there's a big difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion. What we're calling for is a greater transparency, so that the policing of the tax structures can be done and be able to see where there is an illegal activity. Of course, we would want to see all the profits that are created from either labor or extraction in South Africa, in the African continent, paid here, because we need, especially given the reduction in foreign aid over the last year, we need to be funding our own development. Domestic resource mobilization is important, but we need to stop taxes flowing out. We need to tax those fairly who are not paying tax. And then we need to see the way in which we're able to apply the taxation for the benefit of the majority of people.
Well, the G20 summit is going to be right on South Africa's shores in a few days. And I'd imagine this conversation is going to be front and centre, or at least you would like it to be front and centre. What specific measures does Oxfam want G20 leaders to commit to?
A number. But I think just to say that our priorities for this year are inequality, as well as tax the super rich. We're looking at debt justice, climate and energy justice, but also for the acknowledgement of the coalition of the willing. So within the geopolitical crisis that we're in, we want to see countries who are coming together to push for progressive reforms acknowledged. So the question of the tax the super rich at the G20 follows on from the Seville Platform for Action that was introduced by Spain and Brazil, and the South African government supported it in order to tax the high net worth individuals. So we would like to see a commitment to the establishment of an international panel on inequality. So following on the report, the Stiglitz report that President Cyril Ramaphosa launched at the beginning of this week, we would like to see there to be global commitment to an international panel on inequality where issues on taxation can be managed in years to come. We do not want to see what has happened under this G20, which is significant, the progress on inequality and on debt, halted because of G20 presidency next year. So that for us would be a huge, highly significant gain. And also just to see the political will to using ways to reduce inequality. Because as we say in our report, inequality is a choice. And policies are prevalent to reduce it.
Isobel, potentially one of your key stumbling blocks or non-participants could be the United States, because they're not participating in this year's G20. Has there been any traction outside of President Lula in the last few months?
In terms of this coalition of the willing. So absolutely, the President Sanchez of Spain is very supportive of it. We've had messages of support from governments of Norway, of Germany, and Ireland, so countries that are both G20 members and are guest members. There is a realization that the level of inequality is not sustainable, and countries are keen to address it within a group of others. I don't think that you'd often see one country who'd put their hand up and say, I'm doing this alone. So a lot of the conversations that we've been having have been at a level with other countries to try and see that support coming forward.
Okay, so I'm happy you talk about countries can't do it on their own. So let's talk about Oxfam. Who's on your team? Are you working with other agencies to push this agenda? Because one would assume that in this sort of instance, the more the merrier.
Absolutely. And there's no way that one organization can and should be pushing forward for something where we're talking about inclusiveness and democracy. So we work with other organizations, for instance, Tax Justice Network Africa comes to mind. In each country where we have a country affiliate, we work with local civil society organizations. So in South Africa, the Institute for Economic Justice, AIDC. We also work and support UN agencies. So UNDP has been very involved with the inequality reform agenda under this G20 as they support South Africa. And we're going to be part and parcel of the G20 Social Summit as civil society, as well as working with the People's Summit, which is going to be an alternative event, which is all happening in Summit Week. One of the very interesting partners that we work with is an organization called Patriotic Millionaires, which was started in the US and in the UK. And that consists of rich people putting their hands up and saying, we are prepared to pay more taxes. We are not going to leave the countries that we live in, because we believe that we should pay a fair share. So when you mentioned the US, I mean, for me, it's interesting that this organization was founded in the US, where we get told that that inequality is inevitable, and people are saying, no, it's not, and we don't want to live in that society.
Isobel, I want to touch on the G20 report on the inequality emergency. Right, it's an interesting report. Talks about the findings of this recent G20 report on inequality emergency.
The report was a really good piece of work, and it brought together inequality experts. So it was chaired by Joseph Stiglitz, who, as we know, is a Nobel laureate, and the other experts were Professor Jayati Ghosh, Winnie Byanyima, who is head of UNAIDS, as well as Imran Volodia, and Wanga Zembe, who are South African, and Adriana Adena, who's a Brazilian expert on inequality. So the committee did work in extremely a short period of time, and I can attest to the fact that meetings went on late into the night. The benefit of what they've come up with is they've done an overview. So they're not just looking at it from one perspective. They look, for instance, at the role of intellectual property on expanding inequality when it comes to need for medicines. They look also at the international financial institutions, and how debt for African countries and countries in the global south is still much more expensive than those in the north, and looking at not just decision making but also the terms and conditions. Tax the super rich, or greater taxation of wealth, of course, comes in there as being a policy that domestic governments, national governments, can take in order to start reducing inequality. There is also a suggestion, I mentioned the international policy, the IPI on inequality, which is fashioned on the UN IPCC international on the climate. But what they suggest is that each country comes up with inequality busting plans and policies and goals. And that, I think, is one of the lasting legacies that needs to be fought for, so that it doesn't just move on, that wonderful saying, the dog barks and the caravan moves on. Once the G20 has left town, we as South Africa and other significantly progressive countries need to be pushing for the establishment at a domestic level of clear plans that are created not just with the academics and experts, but also with civil society and the business community, because we know that inequality is bad for growth. Inequality is bad for business and profit making. So coming together at that level, as well as at a regional and a global level, we need to make sure that this G20 is known as not only South Africa's legacy, but also as the year in which inequality started turning.
Isobel, as we wrap, paint a picture for us for someone who's living in a shack in Khayelitsha today, of if the various policies that you're advocating were embraced by the super rich, how will their life change? I mean, what is your projection of, okay, let's tax the super rich. What are the implications on the very poor, or those that suffer the greatest inequality?
As a human rights lawyer, for me, the most important document is the Constitution. And the Constitution made a promise to all South Africans that their lives would change. There are constitutional rights to quality education, healthcare, to housing, to social security. But those have been blocked in terms of the progressive realization, because National Treasury says there isn't enough money. They have austerity budgets. So for me, one of the reasons I'm doing this work is I believe that the greater taxation, the greater revenue that is given to the fiscus, the more immediately realizable that better life is for everybody. And there are civil society organizations that are engaging with Treasury on an annual basis to say, we need to have more money and this is how it can be done. So there's a partnership there, but more revenue, I believe, has an incredibly direct impact on the lives of the people that you paint, the ones who are not benefiting from the democratic dividend in the way that I think the crafters of the Constitution believed would be possible.
Isobel Frye, thanks so much for coming onto the show. We certainly would like to call you back post G20 and see if we'll see how much headway those conversations have had.
Excellent, thank you. I'll be here.
That's really that conversation. Senior Policy Advisor for G20 at Oxfam SA, Isobel Frye. A lot more to look forward to when we return. We're back in a moment.